Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be talking about a topic that's both incredibly fascinating and maybe a little bit controversial: the origins of Ashkenazi Jews. We've got some really intriguing sources for you today, including the thought-provoking work of Israeli historian Shlomo Sand.
Ah, Shlomo Sand.
Yeah, he's really known for challenging traditional narratives about Jewish history. So, get ready for a journey that might make you rethink some long-held assumptions.
Yeah, it's interesting how Sand approaches this topic. He really dives right into the heart of the matter by questioning the very concept of a continuous, ethnically pure Jewish people stretching back to ancient times. He argues that this idea is more of a modern invention than a reflection of ancient history. It gained traction really in the 19th century.
Okay, so right off the bat, Sand is challenging a deeply rooted belief for many. What kind of evidence does he use to support this claim?
He takes aim at the traditional narrative of a mass exile of Jews from ancient Israel, which is often used to explain the spread of Jewish communities throughout the world. Sand suggests the historical evidence for this large-scale exile is actually quite weak.
So if not through a mass exodus from ancient Israel, how does he explain the emergence of Jewish communities in various parts of the world?
Sand argues that conversion played a much more significant role in the spread of Jewish identity throughout history. He points out that Jewish communities have often welcomed converts, and this openness to newcomers has shaped the demographic landscape of Jewish populations over time.
That's interesting because it shifts the focus from a purely genealogical connection to a more fluid and dynamic understanding of how people became part of the Jewish community.
Exactly. Sand's argument is all about challenging a static view of Jewish identity. He even goes as far as to say that applying the modern concept of peoplehood to ancient groups can be misleading.
Can you unpack that a bit for our listener? What does he mean by that?
Think of it this way. The way we understand what it means to be a people today, with its emphasis on national identity and shared ancestry, is a relatively recent concept. Applying this framework to ancient societies where notions of belonging and group identity were often quite different can distort our understanding of the past.
So Sand is essentially saying that using a modern lens to view ancient history can lead to inaccurate conclusions. He seems to be suggesting that Jewish identity, especially in ancient times, was more porous and less tied to strict bloodlines than many believe. That definitely challenges a lot of assumptions. But how does this tie into the specific origins of Ashkenazi Jews?
This is where Sand's work gets particularly intriguing. He delves into the Khazar hypothesis, which proposes that at least some, if not a majority, of Ashkenazi Jews might trace their ancestry back to the Khazars, a Turkic empire that flourished in Eastern Europe between the 7th and 10th centuries.
Ah, yes, the Khazars. They're a bit of a historical enigma, aren't they? For those who might not be familiar, can you give us a quick overview of who they were and why they're relevant to this discussion?
Imagine a vast empire stretching across parts of modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, and that was the Khazar Haganate. What makes them unique and controversial in this context is that their ruling elite converted to Judaism sometime in the 8th or 9th century.
Okay, so we have this powerful empire in Eastern Europe adopting Judaism as their religion. How does this connect to the Ashkenazi Jews who centuries later would establish communities in various parts of Europe?
That's the million-dollar question. The Khazar hypothesis suggests that these converts didn't simply disappear into the annals of history. Instead, they may have migrated westward, eventually mixing with existing Jewish communities and contributing to the emergence of the Ashkenazi population.
So instead of a direct lineage from ancient Israel, Sand is suggesting that at least some Ashkenazi Jews might trace their ancestry back to these Khazar converts in Eastern Europe. That's quite a departure from the traditional narrative.
It is, and it's sparked a great deal of debate and research. Sand is not alone in exploring this hypothesis. Several scholars have delved into the historical and linguistic evidence, trying to piece together the puzzle of Khazar origins and their potential connection to Ashkenazi Jews.
Now, before we delve deeper into those arguments and counterarguments, I'm curious about something. Sand seems to challenge the idea of a direct lineage from ancient Israel. But what about the concept of a Jewish homeland? Was that a core belief throughout Jewish history? Or is that also something that evolved over time?
Sand makes an interesting observation about this, too. He suggests that the longing for a return to a Jewish homeland wasn't a central theme in Jewish thought for centuries. Instead, he argues that it gained momentum primarily within Christian circles during the 17th and 18th centuries.
That's fascinating. So the very idea of a Jewish return to their homeland might have originated outside of Jewish thought.
That's what Sand proposes. He argues that it wasn't until the rise of Zionism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that this yearning for a Jewish state became a central focus for many Jews.
It sounds like Sand is really turning our understanding of Jewish history on its head. He's not just questioning ancestral origins, but also how core beliefs about identity and homeland might have taken shape over time, influenced by both internal and external factors.
Exactly. And his work raises so many thought-provoking questions. If the idea of a Jewish return to their homeland wasn't central for centuries, how did that concept eventually become so significant? And if the traditional narrative of a continuous, unbroken lineage from ancient Israel is less certain than we thought, what does that mean for our understanding of Jewish identity, both in the past and the present?
It seems like we're just scratching the surface of a very complex and multi-layered debate. And it's one that has profound implications, not just for our understanding of history, but also for how we view identity belonging and the narratives we construct about ourselves and our place in the world.
So picking up where we left off, let's explore some of the evidence that has fueled this debate about the Khazars and their potential connection to Ashkenazi Jewish origins. One piece of the puzzle that often comes up is a document known as the Schechter letter.
Yes, I remember you mentioning this earlier. Can you remind our listener what this letter is and why it's considered so significant in this whole discussion?
Imagine a letter supposedly written by a Khazar king named Joseph, in which he describes his people's conversion to Judaism. That's the Schechter letter. It surfaced in the late 19th century. And if authentic, would be a pretty remarkable piece of evidence supporting the Khazar hypothesis.
It sounds like a historical smoking gun. But you also mentioned there's some debate about its authenticity. What are some of the reasons why scholars are skeptical?
Well, historians like Stampfer, who have meticulously analyzed the letter, have raised some red flags. For instance, they point out that the author seems surprisingly uninformed about basic details of Khazar geography and culture. It's almost as if someone who wasn't truly familiar with the Khazars tried to fabricate a historical account.
So instead of a definitive piece of evidence, it seems like the Schechter letter adds another layer of mystery to this whole story. What about other historical sources? Are there any accounts from that period that shed light on the Khazars and their conversion to Judaism?
There are. We have intriguing accounts from Arab geographers and travelers who encountered the Khazars. One notable figure is al-Masudi, a 10th century historian and traveler. Think of him as a kind of Indiana Jones of his time, venturing across vast distances and documenting the cultures and societies he encountered.
I can picture him now traversing the Silk Road and jotting down his observations in his travel journal. What did al-Masudi have to say about the Khazars?
He actually provides some valuable insights into their religious practices. Al-Masudi even mentions the presence of Jewish judges in the Khazar capital, suggesting a significant Jewish influence within their legal system.
So we have these tantalizing glimpses into a Jewish presence in the Khazar world. But how do we bridge the gap between these historical snippets and the emergence of Ashkenazi communities in Europe? It seemed like a big leap to assume a direct connection.
You're right, it's not a simple equation. The challenge with interpreting these medieval sources is that they often contradict each other, especially when it comes to the scale and impact of the Khazar conversion. Some accounts claim the entire Khazar population embraced Judaism, while others suggest it was primarily limited to the ruling elite or certain segments of society.
It's like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces and faded images. How do historians navigate these conflicting accounts and try to make sense of it all?
It's a process of piecing together fragments of information, considering different perspectives, and acknowledging the inherent limitations of historical research. Those who favor the traditional narrative of direct lineage from ancient Israel tend to downplay the Khazar evidence, arguing that it's been overblown or misinterpreted.
So they're essentially sticking with the idea that most Ashkenazi Jews can trace their ancestry back to the Middle East, with minimal influence from the Khazars. But doesn't that potentially contradict the genetic evidence you mentioned earlier, which suggests a more diverse mix of ancestries?
It's a valid point, and it's where the debate gets even more complex. While some genetic studies point to a shared ancestry between Ashkenazi Jews and other Jewish populations, including those with a more established connection to the Levant, others reveal a more intricate tapestry of origins.
It seems like genetics, while offering valuable insights, doesn't necessarily provide a definitive answer to this historical puzzle. What about linguistics? How does the study of Yiddish, the language historically spoken by many Ashkenazi Jews, factor into this debate?
Linguistics has become a key battleground in this whole discussion. Those who support the traditional narrative emphasize the dramatic roots of Yiddish, viewing it as evidence of a migration from German-speaking lands into Eastern Europe.
That makes sense. Yiddish does have many similarities to German, but I recall you mentioned earlier that there are alternative interpretations of Yiddish's origins as well.
Absolutely. Some linguists propose that Yiddish might have more complex origins, possibly incorporating Slavic or even Turkic influences, which could potentially strengthen the argument for a Khazar connection.
It's incredible how even language, something we often take for granted, becomes entangled in these debates about identity and origins.
It highlights how deeply intertwined language, culture, and history are, and it reminds us that these categories we use to define people and groups are rarely as clear-cut as we might assume.
Speaking of challenging assumptions, earlier we discussed Shlomo Sand's provocative idea that Palestinians who have lived in the region for centuries might have a stronger claim to ancient Hebrew ancestry than modern Jews. Can you elaborate on what he means by that?
Sand's argument stems from his emphasis on the role of conversion in shaping Jewish identity throughout history. He suggests that if, as he argues, conversion was a significant factor in the growth of Jewish communities, then populations who have lived in the ancient land of Israel for centuries, such as the Palestinians, might have absorbed elements of Hebrew culture and ancestry through conversion and intermarriage over time.
I could see how that would be a controversial idea, especially given the long-standing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians.
It is undoubtedly a contentious claim. Some criticize Sand's work for promoting a revisionist history that undermines Jewish claims to the land, but regardless of one's stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, his research encourages us to question assumptions and examine historical narratives with a critical eye.
It seems like this debate is about much more than just tracing ancestries and historical migrations. It delves into fundamental questions of identity, belonging, and the narratives we construct about our place in the world.
Precisely. And to further illustrate the complexities of this debate, we need to consider another group that adds a fascinating dimension to the discussion: the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, also known as Falashas.
Ah, yes, the Falashas. They have their own unique story to tell, don't they?
Indeed, the Beta Israel claim descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, suggesting an ancient connection to the Hebrew world. They've maintained Jewish traditions for centuries, often in isolation from other Jewish communities.
But earlier you mentioned that their language and lack of rabbinic traditions set them apart. Could you explain that a bit further for our listener?
That's the intriguing part. While their oral traditions and practices point to a Hebrew origin, the Beta Israel don't speak Hebrew or Aramaic. Their languages are Afro-Asiatic, like Amharic and Ogham, and they haven't historically followed Rabbinic Judaism, which is the dominant form of Judaism that developed in the Middle East and Europe after the destruction of the Second Temple.
So their practices suggest a connection to the ancient Hebrew world. But their language and specific traditions paint a different picture. It's like they represent a branch of Jewish identity that evolved along a separate path.
Exactly, and that's what makes them so significant to this discussion. The Beta Israel demonstrate the sheer diversity of Jewish experiences throughout history and challenge any notion of a singular monolithic Jewish identity.
It seems like every layer we peel back in this exploration reveals even more complexity.
And that's the beauty of historical inquiry. It's not always about finding definitive answers, but rather about engaging in a process of questioning, exploring, and expanding our understanding of the past.
I'm curious to hear what conclusions our listener is drawing from all of this. Are they leaning toward one theory over another, or are they embracing the ambiguity and recognizing that definitive answers might remain elusive?
That's the wonderful thing about these deep dives. We're not here to present a single truth, but rather to provide a platform for exploration, critical thinking, and open-minded discussion. The beauty is in the journey, in wrestling with the complexities of history, and recognizing that multiple narratives can coexist, each offering its own insights and interpretations.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into the origins of Ashkenazi Jews, it's clear that this debate goes far beyond academic circles. It touches on sensitive political and social issues, especially in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How does this historical debate kind of intersect with the contemporary realities of that region?
Yeah, that's a crucial point. The traditional narrative emphasizing a direct and continuous lineage from ancient Hebrews to modern Jews has often been used to support Jewish claims to the land of Israel. It forms a cornerstone of Zionist ideology, the movement for a Jewish state. However, the Khazar theory, if true, could complicate this narrative, suggesting that at least some Ashkenazi Jews might not have a direct ancestral connection to the region.
So in a way, the historical debate becomes intertwined with contemporary political claims and arguments about who has a right to the land.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that even within Israel, there are diverse viewpoints on this issue. Not all Israelis adhere to the traditional narrative. There's a growing movement, sometimes called post-Zionism, that questions some of the foundational myths of the Israeli state, including those related to historical origins and land claims.
It seems like this debate forces us to confront some uncomfortable questions, challenging not only historical interpretations but also deeply held beliefs about identity and belonging. For our listener, what are some of the key takeaways you'd like to emphasize?
I think the most important lesson here is that history is not static or fixed. It's a dynamic process of interpretation, reinterpretation, and debate. And these debates are often fueled by present-day concerns and political agendas. The debate over Ashkenazi Jewish origins is a powerful reminder that we need to approach history with a critical eye, questioning assumptions and considering multiple perspectives.
You've mentioned the importance of critical thinking throughout our conversation. How can our listener apply this to their own understanding of history and current events?
It's about being aware of the narratives we're presented with and recognizing that no single narrative holds a monopoly on truth. We need to ask questions like, who is telling the story? What evidence are they using? What are their motivations? By developing these critical thinking skills, we become more informed and discerning consumers of information, which is essential in today's world where information is constantly being shaped and reshaped.
So rather than seeking simple answers or clinging to one narrative, we should embrace the complexity and be willing to challenge our own assumptions. What are some of the dangers of clinging to overly simplistic narratives, especially when dealing with sensitive historical or political topics?
Oversimplification often leads to polarization and conflict. When we reduce complex historical events to black and white narratives, we create divisions and miss opportunities for understanding and dialogue. This is particularly dangerous in situations like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where historical narratives are often used to justify political positions and actions.
It seems like this debate highlights the power of history to shape our understanding of the world, and how that understanding can be manipulated or distorted for political purposes. What can we do to guard against these distortions?
Well, it starts with education and critical thinking. We need to be aware of the biases inherent in any historical account and be willing to consider alternative perspectives. It's also important to engage with diverse sources of information rather than relying on a single narrative or echo chamber.
In this deep dive, we've encountered multiple narratives about the origins of Ashkenazi Jews, each with its own evidence and interpretations. What are some of the broader lessons we can learn from this about the nature of history itself?
One key takeaway is that history is not just about facts and dates. It's about how we interpret those facts, how we connect the dots, and construct narratives that help us make sense of the past. The debate over Ashkenazi Jewish origins forces us to reconsider the very categories we use to define people and cultures. The traditional narrative relies heavily on a concept of peoplehood defined by bloodlines and ancestry. But the Khazar theory and the case of the Beta Israel challenge this notion. They suggest that cultural and religious identities can be fluid and evolve over time, influenced by factors beyond shared genes or geographical origins.
It's a reminder that identity is complex and multifaceted. It's not always determined solely by where our ancestors came from. It can be shaped by choice circumstance and the communities we choose to belong to.
Precisely, and this complexity is something we need to acknowledge and embrace, especially in an increasingly interconnected world where people from diverse backgrounds are interacting and shaping new cultural landscapes.
That's a powerful message of inclusivity and open-mindedness, encouraging us to look beyond rigid definitions and embrace the richness of human diversity.
Absolutely. And ultimately, the search for historical truth is an ongoing process. We may never have definitive answers to questions about the origins of the Ashkenazi Jews, or any other group for that matter. But the journey itself is enriching. By grappling with the evidence, considering different perspectives, and asking critical questions, we deepen our understanding of the past and gain valuable insights into the present.
As we wrap up, what's the final thought you'd like to leave our listener with?
Well, I'd encourage everyone to resist the allure of easy answers and embrace the complexity and ambiguity of history. The debate over Ashkenazi Jewish origin, with its conflicting narratives and interpretations, serves as a powerful reminder that history is not a collection of settled facts, but an ongoing dialogue, a constant process of questioning, revising, and reimagining the past. And it's within this space of uncertainty and debate that we have the greatest opportunity for growth, understanding, and connection.
Well said. It's a powerful reminder that our understanding of the past is always evolving. And it's up to each of us to engage with history critically and thoughtfully, seeking out diverse perspectives and embracing the messiness of it all. So to our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. That's what makes history so fascinating and so relevant to our lives today.